This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I've been using the Fuji X100VI for around 6 months now, maybe a bit more, and in that time I have gone through different iterations of how to set the camera up for street photography, travel photography, portraits, and just general photography, which is what most people would use this camera for. And in this video, I will give you a very basic overview of how to get up and running with your X100 and what are the key settings just to get you going. Specifically, this is not a how to set up the camera video, it's more, these are my photography settings that I use for pretty much all of my photography. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about the camera, I've just released a full X100VI camera guide that goes into great detail about settings, photo, video, JPEG recipes, everything you could possibly need to get you up and running. I've linked that down below if it's something that you're interested in. And let's get into the first point, which is setting up the custom buttons. One of the first things I do to any camera I buy is set up custom buttons, because once you've done that, your photography experience is so much better because you no longer have to dive into menus to change settings that apply to you. And having them on custom buttons accessible at all times will make life a lot easier. Now, keep in mind, this is simply what works for me for how I shoot. You might not like it, and that's totally cool. How I would approach this video is try what I have to say. Some of it you might like, some of it you might not like, and then when you'll watch videos from other people, or perhaps through your own trial and error, at the end you'll have a complete setup that works for you. The first button that we will set up is called Function 1, and it's located right next to the shutter. And I have this set to spot metering lock. What this means is that the camera will no longer expose for the whole scene, but instead it will expose for only where the spot is. Now, if you're using single point autofocus, it will be where that single point is. If you're using zone, it will revert back to the middle of the screen. Whenever you think, how did someone get that high contrast look, you know, the highlight and shadow look, when the highlights are perfectly exposed, yet the shadows fall into black? This is probably how they've managed to do it. Moving down to FN2, we have the ND filter. And because this is a leaf shutter camera, your shutter speed or your maximum shutter speed can't go as high as on a traditional camera. So if you want to shoot in broad daylight, you might run into issues where your mechanical shutter is maxed out. But actually the best use for the ND filter is you can now shoot wide open on a sunny day. So if you want to take portraits, if you want to have some subject separation and it's lunchtime in June, with this ND you could still do that. Another huge benefit of the ND is if you want to get video out of this camera. By no means is this a video camera, however it's extremely capable. Well, now you have a built-in ND that you can use to get your exposure down and make sure that your shutter speed is correct in terms of being double your frame rate. Moving down to AL/AFL, and this button allows us to lock the focus and exposure. It's actually the default setting and I will leave it in that. If the camera had more custom buttons, I would separate it out into AL and AFL separately, but since you're limited with what buttons you can customize, have them together like intended. When you press that button, all that happens is that the camera locks the exposure and the focus in exactly where they are. Moving down to page 2, the rear dial, I have it set to auto ISO, and it allows you to choose between 3 auto ISO presets. I will get into that later in the video because that's very important. The selector switch, which is effectively this little bit there that you pull or push, that is set to face detection. So if I'm ever taking portraits of my mum, of my girlfriend, friends, whatever, that's one way to activate face detection. Now with the selector, you actually have to hold it for a little bit in order for it to engage. And I like that because there have been a few times where I would accidentally switch on face detection, and then that can really upset the focus and the exposure of the scene if you're not taking photos with people in the scene. So by having to hold it for a bit, for me it's a bit of a fail-safe to avoid that happening. Moving to the photography mode, I generally shoot in aperture priority. I find aperture priority to be the easiest one to get the results that I want, and also outside of a slow shutter drag to get motion blur, It's the one adjustment that has the biggest impact on the direction of the photo and what the viewer wants to see, or will see, sorry. So a photo at f2, where the subject is clearly separated from the background, has a very different feel to a photo at f8 or f11, where everything is in focus. Also, it's a very quick way to either let in or block more light. So if you're shooting, for example, on a bright daylight and you go into a dark alleyway, it's very easy to quickly open up the lens from f8 to f2, as opposed to messing around with other settings if you're shooting in manual, for instance. So having tried manual, shutter priority, aperture priority, I find aperture priority to be the most useful one. In terms of aperture values, I always start at f4. I find that f4 gives you the best balance between what's in focus and what's out of focus, so you do have a little bit of separation, but not a crazy amount. Equally, f4 lets quite a lot of light in, but also not all of it. And finally, if you're shooting at f4 and let's say all of a sudden it brightens up, you can quickly close it down to f8, get that light under control. Equally, if you walk into a dark alleyway, for instance, or a market, you can quickly open it up to f2 and have more light available. It's very quick, it's efficient, so yeah, f4 for me is always my starting point, and then I adjust as I go along. The next thing I will set up is burst mode, however the low burst. It's labeled as CL and I'll set it to 5 frames a second. The reason I use the low burst is because if you press the shutter button quickly to take a photo, it only takes 1 shot. However, if you press and hold it, it will take 5 shots every second until you let go. What I found is, especially when there's loads of moving elements and you want to time something, that's enough to get 80% of timing scenarios right. When it comes to RAW versus JPEG, I personally shoot both. Even though I never use the JPEGs, I have them just in case. I know so many people love Fuji cameras for the JPEGs. I've written a bunch of blogs on them, I've tried it. Personally, for me, I need to edit my photos. I hate the idea of the camera editing for me. Therefore, I always shoot RAW. The reason I recommend RAW plus JPEG, even if you only intend on shooting JPEGs, is because there might be scenarios where the JPEG is either blown out or something else happened that needs correction. As good as the camera is, if you have a challenging situation with difficult light or high contrast, it's easily possible for the camera to mess it up. With the JPEG, it's like your final, film scan. You're done, that is what you get. At least if you have the RAW, you can still fix it later in editing. Now let's talk about what I think is the most important aspect of setting up a Fuji camera. This applies to every Fuji camera, not just the X100VI, and this is what can trip so many people up. Whenever you got a photo in auto mode or aperture priority and you don't understand why it's blurry, this is most likely the culprit. I'm talking about auto ISO. Fuji cameras have 3 presets, so each preset you can set up differently for different scenarios, and you have 3 settings within each one. You have minimum shutter speed, which tells the camera what is the lowest shutter speed it can go to. You have the minimum ISO and the maximum ISO. The one thing you have to keep in mind that even if you set a minimum shutter speed of, let's say, 1/200, the camera will override that if not enough light is coming in. I personally can't stand that. I think there should be a way to switch that off and to stop it from happening. But as it stands, it is what it is. So by setting 3 different settings up, we can ensure that the minimum shutter speed that we've set up stays at that level. The first is Auto ISO 1, and that is set up for general daytime photography. The minimum ISO value is 125, which is the base, and the maximum is 6400. In my experience, anywhere within that range, you'll get great photos which are clean and pretty much noise free. 6400, you do start to see a bit of noise, but honestly, it's very easy to deal with, and it doesn't impact the dynamic range or any of those things all too much. The shutter speed is 1/200 because for most scenarios, 1/200 is a good amount, especially on this focal length, to get pretty much everything perfectly in focus without motion blur, sorry. Moving on to Auto ISO 2, and this is my low light setting. This is when I know I'll be shooting at night or low light, and I can be slower with my photography. I'll start with the minimum ISO, which is set to 500 because I want to just increase that and give the shutter speed more room to breathe. The maximum ISO is still 6400 because I want to keep the files as clean as possible, and the minimum shutter speed is 1/100 because even though it's lower, I know I'm shooting at night and I know I need to take it slower and be more steady. Moving to Auto ISO 3, and that is my high shutter speed priority setting. If I need to ensure that whatever I'm taking a photo of has zero motion blur or whatever is going on, I freeze it, that shutter speed is 1/500. In my opinion, that's the safe minimum when you know you're going to get everything pretty much frozen unless it's a high-speed car or something along those lines. The minimum ISO is set to 1000 because I want to give the shutter speed as much room as possible to stay at 1/500. The maximum ISO is now at the maximum native ISO of 12,800. You will get grain, you will need to deal with it in editing, but I'd much rather have some grain to deal with, or noise, sorry, than have a photo that's blurry because the shutter speed was too low. I don't use that last one all too much because I never come across that scenario, but it's there just in case. I'd like to take a moment and thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. It's never been easier to start your own business, blog or YouTube channel and turn your hobby into an income. Squarespace offers the perfect all-in-one solution that is designed to take the headache and hassle out of the entire process. First and foremost, this is your website where you can showcase your product or service in a clean and professional way. Secondly, this is your online store where you can sell your products and services with powerful tools built in. Thirdly, this is your blog where you can write about your industry, therefore increase Google ranking. And there are many other built-in tools that allow you to create members areas, send newsletters, schedule appointments, and much more. Finally, this is all available on your laptop or in your pocket. Add powerful analytics and you have an ideal all-in-one package to run your business. For a free trial followed by 10% off your first purchase, please use the link in the description or use code RomanFox when you check out. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring, and thank you for watching. Now let's talk about setting the exposure compensation, which effectively adjusts the global exposure for the scene. So the camera will expose the scene a certain way, and then you can tell the camera, can you increase or decrease that exposure globally by X amount. I do adjust it depending on what I'm shooting, and it does differ. So let's start with a generic sunny day. Let's just say you're walking around the city, it's sunny. I will keep it at around 0, maybe plus or minus 0.3. Sometimes you can overexpose a sunny day, and sometimes you'll need to control that light. I find that in the winter, when the sun is low and it's really piercing into the camera, underexposing by 0.3 to 0.6 does help preserve some of those highlights. Whereas in the summer, when the sun is higher and things are more uniformly lit, then actually overexposing a bit by 0.3, 0.6 might be excessive. It just lifts the shadows up and creates an overall cleaner image. If you're shooting a cloudy day, let's say it's overcast, there's not much light, I would always increase the exposure to 0.3 or even 0.6. In some extreme scenarios, if it's a proper winter gloomy day, plus 1 is where I would go to. And the reason for it is because gloomy days cameras tend to underexpose. If you're shooting fog or snow, again overexpose. +1 is where I usually go to for fog or snow. Same reasons. The camera looks at the scene, it's bright white because either you have a covering of fog or snow and it thinks it's too much, it needs to bring it down. And then you just end up with muddy photos. So overexpose those and you'll get much cleaner images. Finally, when shooting at night, you'd think you want to overexpose because you want to have everything perfectly visible, but actually you want to do the opposite. If you set your exposure to 0, you look at the back of the camera, then you look at the scene in front of you. In most cases, what will happen is that the screen on the camera will look brighter than the actual view in front of you. So what you want to do there is underexpose by maybe 1 or 2 stops. Now 2 is excessive and it's only for very specific scenarios, but I usually start at -1 and adjust it from there, because that will make the image look more realistic to how the scene is. A big thing that can happen when shooting at night, and again it's counterintuitive, but you can actually blow out the highlights of the windows and the lights at night because you're overexposing. So by bringing that down, you're also controlling the highlights of the image. Now let's talk about photometry settings. We've told the camera what the global exposure level is. Now let's tell the camera what to expose for. There are 4 different modes on the Fuji. I only tend to use 3 of them. The first one's called multi, and effectively the camera looks at the whole scene and says, based on this is the exposure. It exposes for the sky, for the shadows, for the highlights, for everything, and it gives you a good balance. Honestly, on Fuji cameras, this mode is fantastic, and I use it 90% of the time. Moving down is center weighted. Effectively, the camera only exposes what's right in the middle of the frame. If you ever try to take a photo out of a window, you'll find it can be tricky to balance the exposure of inside the apartment or hotel room or whatever, and the outside. And what usually happens is the camera will expose for what's inside, but then the outside will be completely blown out. If you change the mode to center weighted, then the camera will only expose what's in the middle, therefore ignoring what's around the edges. The final one is called spot metering, and as the name suggests, it's the one tiny point that you would put somewhere on the frame. It will expose for that. We've already covered it in the button setup, but you can set it up this way if you want it on a more permanent basis, I guess. Alright, now let's wrap up the video and talk about focusing. This camera has many different focus modes. I only tend to use 2 combinations. The first one is a single point autofocus with a single autofocus mode. So what I mean by that is when you half press the shutter, the camera will focus, but then it will no longer adjust that focus and it'll be locked. And the single point is literally a single square. This is a very precise way of focusing, and it's what I would use for still life, for things that are not moving, landscape, cityscape, all that kind of stuff. If I am not moving and the subject is not moving, that is by far the most reliable way to focus on this particular camera. It might take a little bit longer, but it'll be very accurate. The second way to do it is to use a zone focus mode. Now, I don't mean a traditional zone focusing method, I mean a zone focusing mode on the camera, which effectively is a larger square full of smaller squares. You can change the size of it if you move the joystick to one side and use the dial to change the size. That can be done. However, I use the smaller size and then I will point that roughly on the screen of where I want the camera to focus. I will then set the camera to continuous autofocus mode, and that will then track any changes in distance between me and the subject. So I will use this anytime there's movement in the scene. Maybe I'm walking through a market or through a street, or perhaps there's many different subjects in front of me and everything is moving around. It's definitely not the most accurate way to focus, but it will certainly catch something much quicker. Alright, that's all for this video. I hope you have found it useful. If you have, please give it a like, it does help out. As you can probably hear, I'm losing my voice because this is the 3rd video that I filmed, and yeah, I'm done. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.